93. In the early 18th century, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of transformation unlike any it had experienced before. After decades of military pressure and territorial loss, the empire confronted a new reality in which conquest was no longer the primary measure of power. Instead of responding with immediate warfare, Ottoman leaders turned inward, experimenting with culture, aesthetics, and diplomacy as alternative ways to assert legitimacy and resilience. This moment in history came to be known as the Tulip Era, a short but influential chapter that symbolized cultural openness, refinement, and cautious engagement with Europe. The Tulip Era emerged in the aftermath of prolonged wars that had strained Ottoman resources and exposed the limits of military dominance. By the early 1700s, the empire remained vast and influential, but its leadership recognized that constant conflict was unsustainable. Stability, recovery, and adaptation became urgent priorities. Rather than pursuing aggressive campaigns, the ruling elite sought to project strength through order, prosperity, and cultural vitality. This shift marked a significant change in how power was understood and displayed. At the center of this transformation was the imperial court in Istanbul. The ruling elite began to cultivate an image of sophistication and elegance, emphasizing leisure, learning, and artistic expression. Gardens, palaces, fountains, and pavilions became symbols of a new imperial confidence rooted not in conquest but in refinement. The tulip itself, prized for its beauty and rarity, became the emblem of this era, representing harmony, luxury, and controlled excess. Ottoman elites showed growing curiosity about European culture during this period. Diplomatic missions to European capitals exposed officials to new artistic styles, urban planning, and social customs. Reports sent back to Istanbul described theaters, scientific institutions, printing houses, and architectural innovations. These observations sparked interest rather than imitation. The Ottoman approach was selective, blending foreign elements with established traditions rather than abandoning them. Architecture offered the most visible expression of this cultural experimentation. New buildings incorporated decorative motifs and spatial designs inspired by European aesthetics, particularly from France. Curved lines, ornate facades, and elaborate gardens reflected a departure from the more austere classical style of earlier centuries. At the same time, these structures remained distinctly Ottoman in function and symbolism, serving as spaces for public gathering, education, and imperial display. Literary and artistic life also flourished. Poetry, calligraphy, and miniature painting continued to thrive, supported by elite patronage. Writers and artists explored themes of beauty, leisure, and nature, reflecting the spirit of the age. Intellectual circles expanded, and curiosity about science, geography, and history grew. Cultural production became a means of asserting that the empire remained vibrant and civilized, even in the face of external challenges. One of the most significant developments of the Tulip era was the introduction of the printing press using Arabic script. This innovation represented a quiet but profound shift. Printed books allowed knowledge to circulate more widely, particularly in fields such as geography, mathematics, and history. While religious texts were excluded to avoid controversy, the press still marked a step toward intellectual modernization. It demonstrated a willingness to adopt new technologies without directly challenging traditional authority. Diplomacy during the Tulip era reflected the same spirit of cautious openness. Although permanent embassies had not yet been established, Ottoman envoys increasingly traveled to Europe and returned with detailed accounts of foreign societies. These reports contributed to a growing awareness that power in the modern world depended not only on armies, but also on administration, education, and innovation. Cultural exchange became a form of soft diplomacy, reducing reliance on force. However, the Tulip era was not universally welcomed. While elites enjoyed luxury and artistic experimentation, large segments of the population faced economic hardship. Inflation, currency instability, and rising prices affected urban workers and soldiers. To many observers, the court's emphasis on leisure and display appeared disconnected from everyday realities. This gap between elite culture and popular experience created resentment. The Janissaries, once the backbone of Ottoman military power, were among the most vocal critics. As their influence declined and reforms threatened their privileges, they viewed cultural experimentation as a sign of moral decay and political weakness. Religious conservatives also expressed concern that European influence undermined traditional values. For these groups, the tulip era symbolized excess rather than progress. Tensions eventually erupted into open revolt. In 1730, widespread unrest in Istanbul culminated in a rebellion led by Patrona Halil, a former soldier. Protesters targeted symbols of elite luxury and demanded the execution of leading figures associated with the tulip era. The uprising forced the abdication of the reigning sultan and brought the experiment to a sudden and violent end. Despite its abrupt conclusion, the tulip era left a lasting legacy. It demonstrated that reform did not always need to take the form of military restructuring or territorial expansion. Cultural adaptation could also serve as a strategy for survival. The era introduced new ideas about governance, aesthetics, and knowledge that would resurface in later reform movements. Importantly, the tulip era challenged traditional definitions of legitimacy. Authority was no longer presented solely through victory in war, but through the ability to create order, prosperity, and cultural confidence. The court's emphasis on beauty and learning signaled an understanding that imperial power could be expressed symbolically as well as militarily. In retrospect, the tulip era can be seen as an early response to the pressures of a European dominated world. It reflected an awareness that isolation was no longer viable and that selective engagement was necessary. Although limited in scope and duration, the era opened intellectual and cultural pathways that would later influence broader reforms in administration, education, and diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire emerged from the Tulip era chastened but not unchanged. The experiment revealed both the possibilities and risks of reform through culture. It showed that adaptation could strengthen legitimacy, but only if it addressed the needs of society as a whole. While warfare would remain a part of imperial life, the Tulip era marked a moment when the empire explored alternative ways to assert relevance and authority. Ultimately, the Tulip era stands as a reminder that empires do not respond to crisis in a single way. Faced with decline in military dominance, the Ottomans turned to culture as a tool of renewal. In doing so, they demonstrated creativity, openness, and a willingness to redefine power. Though brief, this period captured the empire's attempt to survive not by the sword, but by the cultivation of knowledge, beauty, and engagement with the changing world.